Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Inauguration Day. My name is Caroline Sandoval, and I'm the Associate Director of the Teaching and Learning Commons and the Director of the Engaged Teaching Hub within the Commons. And on behalf of the Commons, the UC San Diego Changemaker Institute, and the Center for Student Involvement, I want to welcome you to this morning's session. Change making in the classroom and community, and a discussion with Changemaker faculty fellows. In a moment, my colleague Tricia will be introducing our faculty panelists who are doing really incredible and deep, important work in collaboration with their students and their community partners. And before the introductions, though, I want to tell you a little bit about the Changemaker Faculty Fellow Program. So the Changemaker Faculty Fellow Program essentially started out as an idea and an initiative and collaboration between the Teaching and Learning Commons Engaged Teaching Hub and Academic Achievement Hubs and the Center for Student Involvement. And so Kat, who I don't know if she's going to have an opportunity to introduce herself, but I want to highlight her because she's just been such a phenomenal partner in this entire initiative. So it started out as a partnership between the Commons and the Center for Student Involvement. And then we reached out to the Changemaker leadership team and said, we have this program that we are doing and we would love your support, and we'd love to attach the Changemaker name to it because this is really what this is. Change making is really what this is all about. And so they became partners as well. So the Changemaker Faculty Fellows Program essentially it's a faculty development program, and it's a 2-year commitment. Faculty apply for the program, and through a competitive process, they're selected and awarded $10,000. And that seems like a nice small grant, but really the commitment that the faculty make is really significant. They commit to participating in 2 years for 2 years. And in the first year, it's really, we meet monthly as a learning community. So all the faculty participants get together with the folks who are leading the sessions. And we really delve into theoretical foundations of community engaged learning, or community engaged service learning, as some of you may be familiar with the term. And then think about those theoretical foundations and how they apply to the work that they're doing. And the panelists today are from our first cohort. And as I mentioned, they just do phenomenal work. The beauty of this learning community is that really it's an opportunity for faculty who have been doing and are doing wonderful work to just share their ideas with each other and to really come together and support each other. The second year of the program, faculty stay involved to the extent that they are able, and this is one example of their continued involvement. We also have faculty fellows who are returning to to do some work with the current cohort of faculty fellows. So we will be putting out our call for our next year's cohort in spring. We typically put the call out for new proposals in spring, and then faculty are notified in summer. So without further ado, I'm going to hand the mic over to my colleague Tricia so she can do introductions. And again, welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. And if you haven't already, please introduce yourself in the chat.
Thanks, Carolyn. I'm Tricia Taylor Oliveira, and I'm part of the Experiential Learning Hub with the Teaching and Learning Commons, and it's my pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce our illustrious panel of faculty and give you a little bit of their backgrounds and on their teaching research and also projects that they were working on with the Changemaker Faculty Fellows. So beginning with Patty On. Dr. Patty On is an assistant teaching professor in the Department of Communication. Her research interests include Asian and Asian American studies, contemporary Korean and Korean American political, economic, and cultural history, post-colonial and feminist theory, cultural theories of global media, and Hallyu, the Korean wave, digital storytelling, and transmedia activism. Dr. On's Changemaker Faculty Fellows Project focused on transforming a media activism course, Communication 101T, to pilot a community-engaged media production course on community-based storytelling in San Diego. The class was integrated with a larger scale digital storytelling project co-developed with faculty from history, ethnic studies, and communication, as well as with our digital librarians and 5 local organizations. The project aims to build a web-based map and interactive audiovisual database that captures and amplifies the stories of communities who've been displaced and dispossessed by settler colonialism, militarism, and border security in the greater San Diego region, and have yet forged communities of belonging through collective organizing and resistant practices. Dr. On's course partnered with Detainee Allies, a group of activists and faculty who collect and deliver personal letters written to and by migrants held in detention centers across San Diego. Students worked with the organization to bring these letters to life both sonically and visually in hopes of humanizing the detainees' stories. They also worked on conceptualizing how to represent the carceral spaces and conditions detainees must survive through the creative uses of sound and other media forms. Students in the course organized, hosted, and audiovisually documented a letter writing event at UCSD, which serves as an accessible model for other students to continue to coordinate more such events in the future. Thanks for joining us, Dr. On. Second, we have Dr. Abigail Andrews, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology. And her principal research interests are in gender, migration, and political sociology, with a focus on Mexico, Central America, and the United States. Dr. Andrews is director of the Mexican Migration Field Research Program at UC San Diego, which engages students in community-engaged research and advocacy on pressing immigration issues at the US-Mexican border. Established in 2004 by UCSD political science professor emeritus Wayne Cornelius, the MMFRP, the Mexican Migration Field Research Program, is a year-long academic program in which students receive training in methods and migration literature, conduct on-the-ground field research with migrants in the San Diego-Tijuana region, analyze and write up their results, and present their findings to policymakers in both Sacramento and Mexico City. The program's been recognized by outlets like the Chronicle of Higher Education as one of the nation's most innovative efforts to create undergraduate research opportunities at a major university. Under Dr. Andrews' leadership, the program's been adapted to current policy issues of deportation and the Central American asylum crisis, shifting the focus to our own border region, which has garnered intense public scrutiny for the humanitarian and political crises occurring here around migration. She aims to make community engagement and service a more direct element of the program, a process begun by having students volunteer in migrant shelters even as they were conducting research, and by encouraging their own initiatives to establish student organizations and support the migrants involved. Dr. Andrews' Changemaker Faculty Fellows Project focused on redesigning the Mexican Migration Field Research Program to be more sustainable, include more concrete learning outcomes, and produce more immediate public policy accessible results for our broader region, as well as policymakers and migrant advocates more broadly. She collaborated with community organizations, including Casa de Migrante in Tijuana, Desayunador Padre Chava, Madre Asunta, Salvation Army Women's Shelter, and YMCA Youth Shelter. And I will shortly share a link in our chat here that so you can learn a little bit more about that work too. Dr. Fauna Foreman is Associate Professor of Political Science and Founding Director of the Center on Global Justice here at UC San Diego. Her research engages the intersection of ethics, public culture, urban policy, and the city, with a special focus on climate justice, border ethics, and equitable urbanization. Her current research includes a book project on Smith's diverse legacies in 20th century Latin American development, a book project on cross-border citizenship, and various projects on climate justice, including an NSF-funded investigation of climate risk and vulnerability in California's underserved communities. Dr. Foreman is an advocate for engaged social science and university community research partnerships. Together with visual arts professor Teddy Cruz, she leads the UCSD Community Stations, a network of field stations across the border region designed for engaged research and teaching on poverty and social equity, funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, UC Regent Richard C. Blum, and others. Dr. Foreman also partners closely with UCSD Scripps climate scientologist Dr. Ramathan, investigating the social dimensions of climate change, including the influential 2015 University of California Bending the Curve report on climate change solutions, for which Foreman served as vice chair. Papers on climate migration and climate justice presented at the Pontifical Academy of Sciences and Social Sciences at the Vatican, and several high-profile policy collaborations on climate change solutions. Dr. Foreman and Dr. Ramanathan also partner on climate education agendas, piloting Bending the Curve as an undergraduate course that is now taught across the University of California system and at universities around the world. Dr. Foreman's Changemaker Faculty Fellows Project sought to advance the UCSD community stations as a hive of undergraduate research and service activity across our border region. Dr. Foreman worked to pilot community-engaged internship programs with campus units that wanting to embed teaching and learning opportunities in the UCSD community stations, tackling structural questions of staffing and academic credit for students engaged in the field internship program. The internship program they designed can serve as a model for other units interested in developing community-engaged learning programming in the community stations. And again, I'll momentarily pop a link into the chat for you so that you can learn a little bit more about the community stations work too. So welcome to our panelists. Thank you all for being here. And Theo, if you don't mind taking that down, I'd like for us to be able to see one another's faces here as we begin our conversation with the fellows. Would like to just begin by asking if each of you to talk a little bit about what's motivated you to incorporate community engaged learning into your teaching. And if I can ask Fauna to kick us off with that question.
All right. So thank you so much. As a public land grant institution, I've always been interested in doing high impact public research. I mean, I think part of what we do should be invested in public well-being. I really wanted to challenge the conventional model of university research in communities, which too often tends to be a kind of vertical model, where the university sort of figures out solutions on the campus and then descends downward into the community to either test them out or extract what they need and ascend back up. And I was always really interested in changing that from a horizontal model from a vertical model to a horizontal model, where the university and communities are partnering. Everybody bringing knowledges and resources and capacities and expertise to the table to co-produce solutions on the other side. And so once I got tenure and set up the Center on Global Justice, we committed ourselves to community-based research and solutions on poverty and development.
Thanks. Patty or Abigail, do you want to jump in and share a little bit about what motivates you, Patty?
Yeah, sure. I think it came from a desire to engage differently with my students, but also in my own work. I'm trained formally in media studies and work on K-pop and the Korean wave, so popular culture, but with the political analysis. I had alongside that, I'm also a community organizer and have been doing 10 years of anti-racist, anti-imperialist work in Korean communities in Los Angeles. And for me, it felt like those two aspects of my life lived sort of separately because I didn't feel like there were formal spaces with which to kind of hybridize or bring those two things together, at least in the humanities and in my field. And so I found that the one place to do that was in the classroom. And I felt like the push for different sort of experimental pedagogies was moving faster than the kind of push for different experimental research projects. So I really wanted to kind of think about how to bring political analysis and community-based outreach and organizing work through media production in the classroom. That's sort of where it started. I could speak longer than that, but that's sort of the genesis of it. Abigail.
So for me, I think I've just throughout my academic career been craving ways to bring together research with social justice and real community impacts and teaching. Because I think that teaching is our sort of first line of giving something to the world or changing the world. I think this kind of approach has enabled me to bring those things together in ways that really invigorate all three of those arenas. And I'll just talk about the teaching component of it first, in the sense that for me, this kind of teaching is so much more effective to have students doing real research with real people and real audiences and accountability to the people that they're working with, and have an end goal that matters, has been so critical. And I think that's particularly true for students who don't have the money to pay for these kinds of experiences. Often there are sort of social service or social justice trips, but they're paid for. So bringing sort of low-income Latino students who have phenomenal capacities to connect with particularly immigrant communities in the border region, don't have those opportunities and don't perhaps have the training to be able to see how that fits into a research and a social justice agenda.
Thanks. We appreciate those perspectives. And for our next question, Patty, I'd like to start with you and ask a little bit about, as you begin engaging, incorporating these community engaged approaches into your classrooms and your research, where do you find students are challenged by that, and how do you think they benefit from it?
Yeah, I mean, I think in my classroom settings, I really try to organize the culture of the classroom to feel like a community space, an organizing space, and with that requires sort of reimagining a non-hierarchical way of relating to each other in the classroom. So rather than kind of pursuing a top-down banking model of knowledge production and dissemination, I really try to run the course in a way that feels like we're thinking through issues together in relation to each other in the classroom and also in relation to our community partners. So I think it takes some time for the students to deprogram their brain from thinking about like, I'm here for you to tell me what to think and do. Especially at UCSD, it feels like the students in particular have, a very kind of goal-oriented rather than process-oriented way of working through questions, really complex questions. And so, yeah, I think that can be challenging at first, but of course, by week 3, they're like, oh, this is how learning spaces should always be, not just community-based courses, but all learning practices should be this way. So it's a challenge, but also obviously profoundly gratifying and a much more, effective teaching method and practice as well. And I think, for them also, I think having the evaluation methods when you kind of approach the classroom in this way is a little bit more nebulous, right? So I think for them to kind of also let go of that kind of grade-oriented way of evaluation, or sort of productivity or product-oriented way of evaluation is difficult for them too, right? So they're evaluated based on the quality of their relationships to each other. I actually incorporate that into the grading rubric. And they're like, what does that mean? And I'm like, I don't know, but you'll know when you're in it. So I think it's that can be really challenging. But I think I've in every dynamic in every classroom setting is so different. So you have to really approach it and configure it uniquely every time you teach a community-based course. Yeah.
Thank you. Fauna or Abigail, do you have anything to add?
Sure. Well, I really liked what Patty said about non-hierarchical relationships. And I think it's important that happens in the classroom, but it also happens outside the classroom when students hit the ground. And, as a university, we have a responsibility that students understand the ethics of engaging from an institution of power in communities that are often low-resourced and underserved. And again, it's learning how to listen. It's learning that your knowledge is incomplete. There's sometimes an arrogance in the academic world that we have all the answers. So it's learning how to suspend judgment and to listen to people without bringing these conventional sort of assumptions of charity and humanitarian assistance into the mix. It's about learning how to look people in the eye and truly engage in a kind of democratic moment of engagement with communities. So I think students get a great deal from breaking out of the conventional top-down model of academic education through community engaged experience.
Yeah, just to kind of add on to that, I think a couple of big challenges that I've seen. One is that it's sort of operating outside the conventional class structure. Students have spent their whole lives being socialized to sort of like deliver something in writing to a professor, and that's the only audience for it. And that person has power over them and tells them if they're good or bad. And sort of inviting students to step into a more autonomous role with another audience besides the professor, I think can be unnerving for students sometimes. I've also found students, when they have this encounter with people outside of UCSD, and when this is real life instead of just being talking about real life, they can come to recognize their own privilege. And I think that that is a challenge for students, that, you know, building a hierarchical relationship also requires recognizing sort of what the power dynamics are between you and your professor and the communities you're working with. And that can be really challenging, both for students who are sort of easily recognizable as privileged, and for students who, to us within a university setting, appear to be underprivileged, but in different kinds of settings may actually be more privileged than people they're working with. And I think students benefit a lot from both of those, because they're forced to reckon with sort of some things that they wouldn't be reckoning with if they were just discussing it in a classroom. I also think students benefit a lot from being able to demonstrate different kinds of talents and capacities that are not necessarily recognized within a formal classroom setting, right? So we often acknowledge students or give them the most accolades if they perform in a certain way in a classroom setting, such as raising their hand, writing in a way that some students have more training to do than others. But once you get outside of the classroom, students have an opportunity to really shine if they have an ability to empathize with others. That becomes visible in this kind of setting. An ability to listen and connect, right? These things that are not very valued within the university setting that we start to see and can value in these settings. And that can really be great for students, particularly those who sort of have less training coming in.
Thanks. And Abigail, I'm going to ask, maybe building upon that a little bit, if you can talk a little bit about what's something important that you feel like you have learned from your students and from the community partners that you've worked with.
Yeah, thank you. So just to give background, because I require students to be able to speak Spanish, about 90% of the students that I work with in my program are first generation Latino students, generally children of Mexican or Central American immigrants. And the community partners that I worked with pre-pandemic were shelters in Tijuana, migrant shelters in Tijuana. And now during the pandemic, we're working with sort of a wider range of community partners, including a partnership with Fauna's team, but all of whom work with asylum seekers. And I've learned I could go on for days about how much I've learned from both the students and the community partners, but I'll just address a couple of things. It sort of builds on my previous answer. One is, it's just how important it is to listen, both to the community partners and to the students. And I think we as faculty sometimes conceive of ourselves as sort of delivering the information, and that we don't often make a space for listening to what students have to tell us and bring. And in the kind of setting that I'm working in, students just see so many things that I do not see, and they perceive them in different ways because their identity is so different from mine. And listening to students just allows me to understand what our relationship is to the community partners in a completely different way. And similarly, listening to the community partners. And I think that goes along with a different kind of pace. We often kind of try to go at top speed, or maybe that's how I operate. And I've had to sort of adapt to a pace that allows more structured room for listening and communication. And sort of the other thing I'll just say is that I've learned from students how much capacity they have that I didn't recognize within a normal classroom setting. And just it's just so rewarding to be able to see students' phenomenal talents and compassion and all of these things that aren't typically recognized within the university. Yeah, I'll stop there and pass it on to the others.
Patty, I see you reacting. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you create a safe container for the students, they can hold and do a lot, and they want to. They just need a space where they feel like they can, show up in a different way than we kind of allow them to in sort of a more traditional research environment. And so I'm always just my students aren't just like learning sort of political and political histories and histories of social movements, but they're making films, which is incredibly labor intensive. But they always rise to the occasion, and they do everything. They do it with so much fervor and emotional investment, because the space of the classroom feels like they can fail, they can mess up, and take accountability and address or change their approach, or kind of engage in a sort of iterative process. And because of that, I feel like they feel like they can go harder or can push themselves. Not like past the point of their capacity, but definitely like they can push where they can surprise themselves in terms of where their limits are. So yeah, I just wanted to respond to that. I think that's what you're saying too, Abigail, right? Yeah. Did you want me to answer some of the original question about, or did you want to move to Fauna?
About what you've learned? Well, actually, if you don't mind, I'd like to move forward a little bit to another question that I have as well, which is, as we sit here on Inauguration Day, right, as a time for reflection back, I think, on the last years and all that they've contained. And, Fauna, I'll ask you if you can first address this question, which is in light of teaching your course during the current social and political unrest and the global pandemic, what would you like us to know about what the students and communities that you're partnering with are experiencing?
You're muted.
It's obviously a time of incredible hardship for vulnerable communities everywhere, and it's true right here in our own city and in communities across the border. And it really kind of connects with the earlier question about what I've learned from communities. I mean, one thing I think we tend to overlook sometimes as university researchers is how much capital and how much labor communities invest when they work with us, when they work with the university, when they partner with us. I've really come to appreciate the ingenuity and fortitude and courage of communities that are struggling against injustice. And I think we have a responsibility as university researchers to always validate those contributions and validate them through conventional compensation as a matter of labor equity. So I've learned a lot about how difficult it is sometimes for communities to accept our students, right? As wonderful as our students are, that it becomes a burden and a stressor on already stressed and strapped community organizations. So I think it's something we always need to be mindful, and particularly so now because there are so many curveballs. I mean, I was looking this morning at the global poverty index. I mean, poverty is increasing again. We're kind of moving backward, and communities are going to face incredible challenges in the coming years, regardless of whether we're getting shots in our arms. And so I think we need to be really, really mindful of the delicacy of some of these environments and contexts. And I can just say, from the perspective of the communities that I work with through the community stations across the border, this is a really, really challenging time with, waves of migration coming from the north, arriving in a city that's already strapped for public resources, Hopefully new asylum laws will create more flow right now. Maybe today was a good day for asylum seekers. I don't know, but it's a really, really difficult time. And the university should be very, very careful before it asks or seeks to sort of extract data from very vulnerable sites right now.
Abigail or Patty, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, just to build on that, I think sort of the level of trauma that particularly migrant, immigrant communities, both coming to the US or with the intention of coming to the US or in the US, have go through at all times in relation to the United States, but uniquely intensified during these past 4 years and this past year of the pandemic. And that I think that we don't often talk about either the trauma that how to be trauma informed and even approaching or asking to have a relationship with communities. And we don't often talk about secondary trauma, meaning the kinds of triggering that can go on for students involved in this work. That's another thing I've learned a lot about in my own experience of the work, is I've just learned a lot more about trauma and how it works and how it's triggered and how one can be triggered by engaging with people surviving trauma. And that a lot of our students are trauma survivors. In my experience, about a quarter are trauma survivors, at least in the population of students that I work with. And I think we have to know that. And I think that faculty sort of often know on this broad level that students are struggling, but to be able to connect to a little more concretely what those kind of struggles are and how we can support students. I had a student who was living in their car the first half of the pandemic and didn't connect to the internet and therefore didn't connect to class, right? And I think the more concretely we can know what these things are, we can know how to reach out and get the students the support that they need. To echo Fauna, the sort of overload and the kinds of secondary trauma facing our community partners is just something that we have to adapt to. And sometimes adapting means doing less with them. And it's, I think just constant reflexivity about that is really important.
Patty, is there anything that you'd like to add?
I just think, like, having worked, I mean, in my community-based course, I think the communities that I work with most are folks who are incarcerated. And these are the most marginalized, the most vulnerable communities in our in this country. And I think one thing we've read through these, just piles of immensely painful letters written by detainees is to not forget them. And that, abolition should be at the highest priority of our political agenda moving forward. And I think the whole, the rebellions this year really, made that starkly clear for hopefully a wide number of folks. But yeah, I think that is sort of my takeaway, or sort of what I think would be the kind of call right now for the community partners and the students who have taken my classes.
Thanks. Well, thank you to you all. I would like to make sure we open up the chat to folks to ask questions. Well, you're either welcome to unmute yourself and ask a question. This can be a conversation, or if it's more comfortable to pop something into the chat for our panelists, please feel free to do that. So I want to invite some of those questions. And one that has already come up from Carolyn is how can we as an institution here at UC San Diego support faculty in being able to do more of this kind of teaching, especially without having to wait until getting tenure or navigating some of the other barriers?
I can start. I mean, I started doing this work pre-tenure, and I think this came up 10,000 times in our meetings with the Changemaker fellows, but like, we need money and we need institutional support. And I think the question is, how do we get to that structural change? And by institutional support, I mean department chairs and deans and so on, encouraging and embracing this kind of work by letting up on other requirements, this kind of thing. And all of this, of course, takes money. I also think that sort of maybe an easier thing is just mentorship. I will just say getting to know the other faculty members, particularly more senior faculty members in the group, was really helpful and inspiring to me to see how other people had tread this path. And I've been able particularly to connect with Fauna and, actually collaborate together, starting to collaborate together this year. And I just wish I would have met her sooner. And others who are more senior, who've sort of been struggling in doing this work. Because I think sometimes as an assistant professor, you don't know as many people and you just feel like you're kind of like treading water alone or trying to figure it out on your own. So I do think kind of just more formalized structures of mentorship to support younger faculty in getting into this stuff is really important.
That's really wonderful. If I could just follow up, Abigail, quickly. I feel absolutely the same way, Abigail. I mean, it's been just amazing meeting you and recognizing our convergences and so on. Another way to say what Abigail said at the beginning is we need to rethink the relationship between research, teaching, and service and the way faculty are evaluated. Okay. Too often this kind of work is put into the sort of dustbin of service and is not valued as an advance in research and an advance in teaching method. And I think until we stop seeing this as university charity, we're not going to make progress in really integrating this into the university's research and teaching mission.
I came in as a research professor and I switched over to the teaching line so that I could do this work without feeling like I was working against a crushing clock. And also because in the research line, this kind of work doesn't count for anything. So, community-based courses, as we all know, like take 2-3 times as much work, but it doesn't count for more teaching units. There's no course release. The money is amazing and, it all went to the community partner, but the reality is that, the kind of the specter of, will this count for tenure or not? Having that question in your mind as you're trying to like fight for the most vulnerable community. I mean, it's just like, it's the disconnect there is it's disorienting, it's counterproductive. So yeah, I think like figuring out different ways of evaluating or valuing this work. I'm happy to be in the teaching line, but your teaching load increases by quite a bit. So I'm teaching 6 a year now. So the thought of making 2 of those classes or even one of those classes a community-based course feels a little bit daunting. So this was not meant to be a complaint platform, but just more like, we need to figure out evaluation models, like genuinely, incorporate them for community-based research and teaching.
Thank you for sharing that, Patty. So we have a question from Amy. Where can students find out more about the Letter Writer event or how to get involved in collaborating with detainees? In other words, how can we plug into Patty's great project?
Well, sadly, the core that I taught was winter 2020. So we got cut short 2 weeks of our class. So the students basically turned in rough cuts of their films and I kind of left it to them to work on it on their own, but they couldn't go to the media lab to edit finish the edits. And we couldn't gather to do the letter writing itself. But I can share some info. Detainee Allies is actually now called Allies to End Detention, and they're in the process of restructuring, as many community orgs do often. So I will get some more updated information to you all about how to get involved into write letters and get involved with the project itself.
And we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So I'd just like to open it up to our audience if anyone would like to ask any more specific questions about anybody's projects or just generally.
I just want to make a follow-up comment to what we were talking about with regard to supporting faculty. At the Commons, we're always looking at ways to better support our faculty in multiple ways, but especially those who are doing the kind of work that you all are doing. And one of the things that's become apparent to me, I'm still fairly new to UC San Diego, but I've been on a few committees related to grants that faculty apply for, teaching grants. And I think sometimes people reviewing those don't really know the labor involved in the work that you do. And for example, how much more time your assessment takes than others. Like grading student reflections is not like grading a multiple choice exam, right? So there are just lots of things that I think go unnoted in, say, for example, faculty applications for some of these things. And so I don't know that I necessarily have any other point than to say that what you shared with me is a reminder of just the various entry points we have to try to make this kind of work more present and more understandable to folks who are just unfamiliar, again, with the kind of labor that's involved in this.
That's really true, Carolyn. And not only, you know, the intensity of the engagement with our students, but the logistical demands of coordinating this kind of work. One like cheer for the light rail is it's going to make it a lot easier for students to get into the field and for our partners in the field to come into the campus. It's going to create this amazing two-way flow. So a lot of that logistical work that falls on people like Patty and Abigail and me will be lessened. I think the travel issue is going to be much, much easier very soon.
That is a very, very good point. That the ability to get out into the community is huge. Living up here on this in this ivory tower, I guess figuratively living in the ivory tower currently. Just as we close, did any of you want to make any final statements about your work in this area, being part of the Changemaker Faculty Fellows program, or otherwise? And we can start with Patty.
Yeah, I just want to thank the Center for Teaching and Learning for making a space like this. I've done community-based courses in small liberal arts settings, and it's a lot easier because the courses are smaller. You know where the resources are. There's more grant money, but doing it in such a large research environment like this is it's daunting and it's logistically complicated. And you know, it's like what Abigail was saying earlier, there are so many folks who are doing incredible work in the classroom. I don't know where they are, who they are, what they're doing, how we can share resources. And so to create a space of connection and shared resources has been just, you know, tremendously helpful, and it makes me feel a little less alone in doing the work that we're, you know, and it's just knowing that we're carrying this work together has been really moving and powerful. So I just want to thank you all for making a space like this.
Yeah, second that. Thank you so much. It's I wish we could see each other in person, but hopefully we'll resume that. But yeah, it's been really, really helpful. And I think even just putting out this kind of grant and this kind of, but tying it to a community was a really nice way to set it up, because it could have just been a grant, right? And instead it was a grant tied to building a community. And people probably wouldn't have shown up if that wasn't tied to money. But it actually did allow us to, I think, create kind of this ongoing dialogue that was just really helped me to kind of innovate and rethink as I was going through the process of doing this work last year.
And you know, the first cohort, I mean, the people that assembled really are very committed to doing this kind of work. And so we were sharing practices and a lot of knowledge after years of doing this kind of work. But it would be great to see the space become open to curious faculty who maybe haven't done it before but want to figure out how. And I'm sure I speak for all of us in the first cohort that we would be very happy to mentor or to participate in sort of, you know, sharing our experiences in that process.
I will say one of the greatest skills that I have in doing community-based learning is being scrappy. So I just encourage folks who feel like, oh my God, this is going to be another mess. I mean, it is going to be a mess. You know, that's just part of what it is to do this kind of work and being okay, and to be okay with that. But you know, it is a risk, and it does take time to kind of refine and hone your approach. But I definitely encourage folks to make that step and try to think about their teaching practices in more outward community-facing ways.
Well, thank you all. I really just want to take a moment to formally thank you, Abigail, Fauna, and Patty, for your insight and for being willing to share your experiences with others. I can say from my own perspective that it's really been a joy having the opportunity to work with all of you, and it's just so inspiring. the work that you all are doing, and I appreciate it a great deal.
Here, here.
And to our audience members, we'd like to close with just asking you to, if you don't mind, taking a moment to pop into the chat something that you are taking away from this discussion. So what's one takeaway from this discussion that you think you will plan to implement in your teaching or work? And or what are some pressing issues in our region that directly relate to your teaching and research, so that we can kind of get a sense of that as we're going forward as well. So invite you to pop those notes into the chat for us. And thank you for joining us today, and also want to invite folks to apply to the next cohort of Changemaker Faculty Fellows. As Carolyn mentioned at the beginning, we hope to open that up in spring, and we can keep a list also of attendees here at this session to make that information available to folks as well. So thank you all.
Thank you. It's good to see you
everyone.
all.
Thank you, panelists. It was such an honor to be here with you and to be a part of this discussion. It was really, really amazing.
I feel the same. Bye.
Everyone.
Hey, everyone.